So thank you everyone for coming today. So today we have Kenzie Friesen, who is a postdoctoral fellow in SIPRC, so the Sports Injury Prevention Research Center, and she's supervised by Carolyn Emery. So I'm going to be kind of brief with the introduction because Kenzie's going to kind of go over her background in research. But so Kenzie is kind of on the job market and she's kind of wanting to practice like a job talk type talk. So she would really appreciate if you could think of some things that could be changed or improved and give Kenzie some free feedback on the talk. So a couple of things in terms of that, just to give you a bit of direction. So if you have some things that you think that Kenzie should change rather than just kind of identifying the problem, solutions are very much welcome. And then the second thing is it's also helpful to kind of get positive feedback. So also in addition to things that could be changed, it's also helpful for Kenzie if you tell her kind of what you also liked. So with that, I'll hand it over to Kenzie.
Thanks. I think this is working. You can hear me okay? Awesome. Thanks for coming. I was just reflecting. I think this is more people than who come to my conference presentations at times. And like very few SIPRC people. So it's a new audience, which is nice. So like Steph said, I'm in the process of interviewing for faculty positions. This one specifically, I've shaped my background and my research plan to fill this sort of criteria. They've asked for a community engaged scholar with research expertise in physical activity, movement, or sport aligned with their themes of Indigenous wellness and child and youth development. So that's kind of the lens to view some of this under. And with that, I want to start with a quick land acknowledgement. I live and work on Treaty 7 territory right now. And it's really important to me to reaffirm my relationship with all those that we share the land with. And so who am I? My name's Kenzie Friesen. I'm a wannabe professor. That's where I'm headed in this journey as of right now. Sometimes I don't know if I know exactly what a professor does all day, but I have this idea that they do some teaching, you get that mentorship with students, the impact in that way. You do your research program that you're really invested in and you're excited about. And then you have your service component and your knowledge translation, trying to get your findings into practice. So all those three sort of hats that I envision us wearing, I'm really interested in that realm. I also like to joke that I'm a washed up athlete. So I love sports and that really informs a lot of the research that I do now. I'm also a passionate coach. Wherever I end up finding myself, I tend to give a lot of softball pitching lessons or just different information sessions with different groups. Usually softball, that was my biggest background. And then I'm also a proud aunt. I've got 3 little kiddos back in Saskatoon. This one's especially crazy, as you can imagine, the red hair and the tongue out. So they're always fun to hang out with. And then I enjoy the outdoors, and obviously I'm a huge sport advocate. So that's kind of who I am, where I've been. I started in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and then I went to Lynchburg, Virginia. So I went there originally to do a Bachelor of Science in Exercise Science. And to play softball. And so while I was there, I earned my certificate exercise physiologist. And what ended up happening is, you can see on my left leg there, tore my ACL my sophomore year. And so that led to me wanting to quickly squeeze in a master's, not really knowing what that would help with, but got a master's of science in exercise science and my CSCS through the National Strength and Conditioning Association. From there, I went to Auburn, Alabama to do a PhD in kinesiology. That wasn't really the plan, albeit right off the bat, but what happened is as a player at Liberty in Virginia, I got pulled in as a participant into their biomechanics lab. So you can see on the left there, I'm fully hooked up to their electromagnetic system, and I'm about to pitch, throw some softball pitches, a variety of softball pitches, and then they measure my biomechanics. And I, at that point, didn't know what most of that meant, but thought it was amazing that you could study softball pitching biomechanics given my background. So you can see 1 year later, I'm now not an undergrad, a PhD student in the lab. I'm holding the cord. So I really didn't move up too far in terms of along the journey, but you got to start somewhere. So that got me into my PhD there. And it really helped bring about this idea of wanting to improve the sports ban, and that's what I call it. So how do we improve the sport experience for everyone who wants to participate? So one, that's bringing people into sport who want to be part of it, and then it's keeping people there through injury prevention efforts and keeping them safely involved in sport. So my PhD journey really started in this second bucket here. Together, Gretchen Oliver was the supervisor of that lab. Did a lot of research trying to understand injury risk in softball pitchers. And you might ask why softball? Well, the inevitable is I enjoy softball, but also there are really high participation rates in both Canada and the US. There's also really high injury rates, particularly at the shoulder joint. So before I go too much further, I always like to show what a softball pitch looks like, just so we're all a little bit familiar. This is slowed down, and my biggest pet peeve is when softball gets, I guess, misconstrued with slow pitch. So this person's driving really hard off the mound. Pitching arm goes through total circumduction. It's quite a asymmetric motion and involves really high velocity. So at Auburn, we were using this electromagnetic motion capture system, sensors placed on a variety of body segments. And you can see those cords coming off, they're cabled to a host computer. At this point, people usually wonder, how do you throw a pitch with all these cords? So then I like to show this video here. Being I was a participant first, then a researcher, I can vouch that it is possible, and you do get some of that period of familiarization before you start getting tracked, obviously. So typical in these sporting task biomechanic assessments, we tend to break down the pitch into, or the motion into, different events and phases. This is sort of common, maybe a bit more than you would normally see in softball pitching, but big events of interest would be something like foot contact, and then ball release, of course, very similar to baseball or other sporting events. And then you would maybe look at more phases of interest. So baseball, for instance, that key event is typically max external rotation. You can see this athlete, you're not born with that much external rotation, that develops over time. So we tend to look at that position. In softball, we really honed in on ball release, and it's at these events that we see the highest kinetics in terms of on the elbow or the shoulder. And so we think that those are related with injury. In terms of baseball, we know the elbow valgus force is leading to that UCL rupture. In softball, we're thinking it's the shoulder distraction force leading to a lot of biceps tendon strains in softball. There's also really high repetition and way too long of training seasons that lead to a lot of these injuries as well. And so during my dissertation, I sought to use statistical parametric mapping. It allows us to analyze these motions, not just at those key events, but over time as they change. So if you think of like your elbow motion and you're going through elbow flexion, you can only move your elbow so fast over time. So between those two frames, they're going to be dependent on one another and smoothed in some capacity. And so when we tend to look at, really just one sliver, one piece of the pitching motion or one piece of the puzzle, SPM, I think, allows us to look at the whole picture. And I can imagine you weren't imagining a raccoon being all excited, but it gives us a better picture looking at, of course, the whole motion. So my dissertation goal was to use SPM to analyze the whole waveform of data. And as I was, going through the lab, I learned more and more that our pitchers in pain, they're typically taller, heavier, and have a higher body mass index. And so that was really interesting. We see that there are pitchers of larger stature at really high levels of the game. So if you watch the College Softball World Series or you watch international softball, a lot of the pitchers are bigger in stature. And so I started to theorize, maybe there's this injury performance trade-off. When you're larger, maybe you're more successful in terms of pitching higher velocity throwers, but research is showing that maybe you're more prone to injury. So I hypothesized sort of this seesaw effect. Maybe it's better in some cases, worse in others. So I used a DEXA scanner on 45 different softball pitchers. And there's a number of research questions, but one separated our pitchers into two groups, one with a high body fat percentage and one with a healthy body fat percentage. And the main finding from that was just that those with higher body fat actually were throwing with a decreased pitch velocity or throwing with lower velocity. And they also had increased shoulder distraction force. So their this theory didn't really hold up, I'm assuming, or was able to say then that I don't think there's this injury performance trade-off. I do think being having that extra body fat was worse in terms of both performance and your injury susceptibility. In terms of the SPM, I just wanted to quickly show how I use that in some capacity. So as this line here passes the critical threshold, you can see that ends up not being significant with an adjustment, but this here is significant. So between our high body fat percentage group and low body fat percentage group, around that 75% of the pitch, we do see there being differences in terms of elbow angular velocity. And so what's really happening around that time is those with high body fat percentage really aren't changing their elbow motion too much. Meanwhile, those with a healthy body fat percentage are. And I think that's really important. You can see it's happening just prior to ball release here. I think that's really important in terms of the timing and the whip that you're able to get on the ball, particularly during that ball release phase of the motion. So there's some interesting findings there. I guess I felt pretty confident saying that the increased presence of body fat may alter some body motions in your segmental sequencing through these types of sporting tasks, and particularly pitch execution in this place. Typically in these youth sports settings, we're seeing, especially in softball, one person takes a rep, then they walk to the back of the line, they wait for their turn to take another rep. And so there are some extension publications and immediate translation activities that went out to try to healthily prioritize more fitness into practice, diversifying your skills and drills, and having shorter practices, but more movement involved during that time. So through a lot of this work, that was a cross-sectional study. A lot of our studies were looking at associations, and we know that that doesn't really equal causation. And so leaving this lab, I thought, it'd be really neat if we were able to prospectively track these athletes and see how does their health history change over time? And then also how does their kinematics or their kinetics change over time as well? So that was sort of my big idea leaving the Auburn lab post-graduation. From there, I went back to Saskatoon, Saskatchewan to work as a postdoc at the University of Saskatchewan. And this time, the plan was actually to incorporate a prospective tracking, athlete tracking program there. They have a new sports science and health center that was kind of just getting going at that time, but we were met with a lot of red tape, being it was sort of the midst of COVID. So we sort of switched gears and instead focused on this first bucket, improving the accessibility to sport. So together with Karen Chad, we dreamt up the Tri-Sport League. And so this was a new league we created in Saskatoon, and it had sort of two unique components. It was completely free, and it involved multi-sport participation. So we received funding from the Canadian Tire Jumpstart program that covered all the uniforms, snacks, coach honorariums, rental fees, insurance, things like that. And then within that one league and on the same team that the athlete was part of for the full league, they were participating in 3 different sports. And so the main reason for doing this is sports becoming more and more time consuming and expensive. And so we were trying to remove some of those typical barriers to organized sports participation. And then we also know there are a lot of benefits to doing multi-sport sampling. And so that was sort of our big why behind starting this league. So athletes were designated to one team for the duration of the league. And that was really neat. Coaches were able to build up a lot of camaraderie within their team, make it a really competitive environment for them. And so kids would sort of filter in off of, we specifically put it in a core community area of Saskatoon where transportation would maybe be less of an issue. So we'd see our kids kind of filter in around 6 p.m. They'd go find their one coach, get totally set up with their equipment and get right to activities right away. So the first 2 weeks involved soccer activities. Then we moved into kickball. Me being biased, obviously, I wanted softball, but the feasibility of getting all the gloves was a bit challenging. So kickball was fun too. And then football as well, or flag football, I should say. So each session was an hour. We didn't want to take all night for their parents, but the first 10 minutes was getting them, fitted with equipment and getting a good warm up in. Then the next 20 minutes or so is some sport-specific drills, getting them ready to learn and play the game. And then the last half hour was competing against one of the other teams there. So it was all everything kind of all one-stop shop in a sense. So this is by the numbers. This is actually only from season number 1. We're in our 3rd season right now, and our numbers have continued to grow, which I'm kind of excited about. So typically we'd have about 40 athletes per session. We got up to 90 registered this most recent year, which is fun. And then we had 20 survey respondents. So parents or guardians of these children ended up filling out a survey to give us some good feedback. One thing I'll note is we had a pretty good variety of athlete ethnicity and household income. We're trying to appeal to a large range of audience here. And then we wanted to know what was the top reasons for joining the Tri-Sport League, like what appealed to you. And so top 2 reasons were it was free of cost and it fit well with their schedule, which are really 2 of the main barriers we were trying to remove. We also see that 9 of 19 athletes participate in organized sport for the first time being involved in the Tri-Sport League. So we considered that a neat success as well. And then I'll also just say 13 of 18 athletes wouldn't have done sport that summer if not for the Tri-Sport League. So we were pretty excited to be getting people involved in multi-sport activities that maybe otherwise wouldn't have been. Also at USask, I was able to still be part of biomechanics a little bit with Dr. Angelica Lang. She has the Musculoskeletal Health and Ergonomics Laboratory. And we were able to I was able to use a new motion capture system. So it was a Vicon camera system and XN sensors to track scapular motion during work-related and functional task protocols. So it wasn't sport specific. I was missing maybe that component, but it was cool to learn some other motion capture procedures as well. Typically in baseball and softball research, we negate the scap just because it's hard to track during such a high velocity motion, but this we were able to focus specifically on that, which was neat. From there, like I sort of mentioned, I was missing my sports involvement. And so the Sport Injury Prevention Research Center posted a position for a biomechanist using wearable technology. And so I jumped on that opportunity to come to U Calgary last year about this time. So I'm now part of the Shred Concussions project. So we've got about 6,000 participants Canada-wide, and we're doing this longitudinal tracking of athletes in our REDCap database. Specifically, I've been tasked with using instrumented mouth guards. So they have a triaxial accelerometer, gyroscope, as well as a proximity sensor. And so when the mouth guard or the sensor moves above a certain threshold, that registers as a head acceleration event. And so we've been really trying to look at the athlete injury and mechanism of injury using this sort of interdisciplinary approach or a multimodal approach we've been saying. So we have instrumented mouth guards. We've also been using a little bit of FD NIRS, frequency domain near infrared spectroscopy, as well as we're tracking injury and exposure over the course of the season, and then using video analysis to identify mechanisms of injury. So on what a day actually looks like, day in my life here at U Calgary is going to a wrestling meet and then baseline measure before they do any activity. We'll take them into our Shredmobile. So it's our lab on wheels, we like to say. That's where our FD NIR system is housed. They'll get a brain oxygen measurement. Then they'll go in, they'll wrestle wearing their mouth guard and with our video camera watching them. So we're able to identify the head acceleration events that the mouth guard spits out on camera. And then post-match, they get a NIRS measurement and so forth throughout the day. I'll also say we are getting measures of clinical symptoms when we're doing the FD NIRS testing as well. So presence of headache, neck pain, a host of those questions that you see at the end of the SCAT-5, if you're familiar with that. So that's been what my work looks like here. When I think about my journey, maybe as you're listening, you're thinking, okay, how does this all sort of piece together? And so when I think back on my experiences, there's been motion capture, working with sports biomechanics and knowledge translation to users, first at Auburn. Then at USask, I really wanted to focus on that first bucket, plus increase some skills in the tech with technical aspect of biomechanics data capture. And then here at UCalgary, looking at a large scale database using prospective athlete tracking and some more technology there. Skills new and old. I think that working largely a lot with athletes, the skills to interpret data for a user group but definitely been developed over time, as well as data visualization, being able to accurately represent the data to coaches or athletes or clinicians. As well, have a diverse sport perspective. I didn't really foresee myself working in wrestling, but that's been really fun to learn a new sport. As well as communication skills, informal through working with user groups, but also formally in presentation and scholarly publication. And then being able to develop convincing speech over time to obtain a few grants and publish as well. There's also been new and old connections and being, sort of spread out over time. So the NFL Shred Concussions Executive Committee, and part of that, the Traumatic Brain Injury Research Consortium. There's a few in the concussion realm, but also staying close to the Society of Biomechanics internationally in the Canadian group as well. So that sort of leads my background to now inform my future research plans. Starting with the first bucket this time, want to improve accessibility to sport. I want to make sports available and enjoyable. And while we know that multi-sport sampling there's many benefits, I think there's a lot of poor infrastructure to support that progression for athletes. And so when I think about the Tri-Sport League, I'd love to expand that out to now include more rural communities, Indigenous communities, and keep implementing multi-sport experiences among that youth population. I also would love to eventually do some sort of testing versus a single sport league versus a multi-sport league. And that involves prospective athlete tracking, but also a large database to look at exposure, to look at skill levels, enjoyment, physical skill development, things like that. In terms of the second bucket, I'd like to now incorporate a prospective athlete tracking program to learn about modifiable injury risks and to really lower that injury risk for athletes, and to maybe see how those differ between males and females. A lot of my work to date has focused on female athletes. And so being able to track athletes over a season, do some biomechanical testing specific to their sporting tasks. So softball pitch for softball pitchers, the smash and volleyball, this could be applied to a variety of sports, and seeing how injury and performance changes over time, I think would be neat. And then there's also a lot of other things that you can gather to get a more holistic approach or view of the athlete. And so that could be different things such as your mental health, wellness, physical development, growth and maturation, things like that as well. So those are sort of the high level plans that I have. When I think about getting into a position someday, I want to have a strong start, but I also know you need to leave room for some versatility to adapt to meet the needs of your community. So and attempting for a strong start, I've broken it up into a few different years. So that first year, being able to understand youth injury rates among, and I'm starting in softball given my background, but trying to understand injury rate among youth softball pitchers in Canada with a quick survey to understand the need of that space, set up a lab space, and then to build some rural partnerships in order to be able to collect data outside of just those urban centers and incorporate more participants. Different grant options as well. And then start recruiting a master's student. Year 2, I'm looking to be able to start comparing motion between reps and between days. So we know what's a meaningful change in terms of our biomechanical output as the season progresses. And then I'd like to start implementing Tri-Sport in different communities than just that core community in Saskatoon where I had started. Again, some more grant opportunities and then recruiting a few more students, building up the lab. And then finally, I think it'd be neat to maybe incorporate something like THEA to get markerless motion capture going, so you can get a lot of athletes in and through the lab as you want to prospectively track them over time, and see how that might differ in a field versus a lab setting, again, to understand the utility of these protocols. So in general, the goal is to understand how to implement motion capture in unique settings with diverse participants and to be able to quantify movement. So we've got a good base to go from. Again, that's a plan that I know will change. And I do think that I've talked a lot about softball, but this can really be applied to any population group. So I just threw out lacrosse, hockey, volleyball, a host of different sports that this could be applied to. I've also listed a few funding options that I think would maybe align well with my research initiatives. So anything from, not anything, but some of these from SSHRF Foundation might be important. I think Own the Podium being sport focused might be good as well. I've had the opportunity of being part of a MyTex grant before, and they have really good learning opportunities. So that would be a great option for students. And then the NSERC Discovery, of course. As I think about this talk, I've left it blank, but I do have, suggested collaborations. That's been positive feedback in the past that I should be engaging other faculty members as well as other partnerships in that space. And so what I'm hoping to add to the college that's already very well developed, but I think that there's a good opportunity for an interdisciplinary approach and collaborations within the College of Kinesiology. I also think there's good opportunities for student engagement and working directly with athletes and getting them applied to this applied sports research. And then some good impact locally within sports and teams and athletes in the area, but also beyond as well. So I'll say thank you, and I'm open to any feedback or questions that you might have.
Thanks so much, Kenzie. Does anybody have any questions? Jackie?
Oh, sorry. Thanks, Kenzie. So you mentioned later in your presentation that one of your initial plans is to start a lab to track injury rates amongst softball athletes. So I assume this would be a biomechanics lab, and so I guess I'm curious in knowing or understanding what you envision that lab being. Is it more of a biomechanics lab, and do you have any ideas on what some of your initial studies would be in that lab?
Yes, so I don't know exactly how this is going to work when it comes to that. I know there is a biomechanics lab that's shared among the biomechanists, and there's different motion capture settings there or technologies there. I envision those first few studies being able to quantify meaningful changes in motion. So right now, it's dawned on me that we've done so much softball research, but if we're going to try to understand how motion changes over time or what's an important change over time, we have to know what's your standard variability between reps and between days of the motion capture system specific to that sporting task. So those are the first couple of research questions there.
I guess this is, yeah, like a comment. I like the research like timeline and things, but the one thing I felt like you had that slide, like that pop-up box at the end, where you say this is kind of the thing, and there felt like there was a bit of a disconnect between like the beginning, it's like, oh, I'm interested in studying sport injury prevention in this context, to then going, it was like, I want to implement motion capture in like novel settings. And I think it might be useful to like bring it back around again and say, specifically like how each of those three studies will help you achieve the goal.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. Those first two like big studies I presented, like I know those will take time, so that these are like the working up to that, but I agree, I should be tying it back to those.
Yeah, thanks. Like more cohesive package.
Yeah. This is why this is being recorded. I can come back. Thank you. Matt Jordan.
Yeah, great presentation. I just was curious about that slides that you had on your softball pitchers and their the relationship there with body fat percentage and then injury mechanisms potentially. Did you have any insights on what you think might be mechanistically driving what you saw? Do you think it's the body fat percentage per se, or is it maybe something to do with the strength of power to mass ratio, or how they have to move to get off into the line more on the shoulder or something like that, because they don't have the speed off the shoe now? Or
Yeah, there was a host of different variables we looked at. One was kinematics, in terms of we do see that our pitchers get away from their body a little bit more. which could be increasing perhaps some of that torque that they're seeing on the shoulder. And that is impingement reasons, most likely, and creating space for the arm to pass across the body. So that's kind of happening around ball release. So that's kind of one idea there. I think also from an inertia perspective, it's going to be harder to manipulate those segments to maybe get some of the intended outcomes. So I do think there's adaptations in how that sequencing is happening, as shown with that angular velocity graph. So I think there's like a myriad of things playing a role, but yeah, great question.
Hi, Kenzie. Thank you for your talk. I'm also a washed up fastball player, so I really appreciated the softball lens and all the videos you included. Similar to Matt's question, my question was, what's a high body fat percentage? What was that?
Yeah, good question. So these were 14 to 18-year-old girls. It's a random selection, and so I was just hoping for participants. It was also at the end of 2020, so we had struggles there, and I remember saying like, well, I hope we get an even split of sorts. It actually, I was again located in Alabama, so that maybe answers a bit of this, but it ended up being that we had more high body fat percentage than healthy body fat percentage, and that breakdown was around 32% body fat. So we had a number of 14-year-old pitchers who were 250 pounds, 40-some% body fat. So it is a significant range that we're working with in terms of body size and dimensions.
Yeah, that's interesting because like we would expect body fat to increase
Yeah.
adolescent anyway. So sometimes those hard cutoffs are tricky, and there's some age specific body fat percentage like Z scores that are used instead. But it sounds like sort of your group was kind of well above that threshold.
Yeah.
I was just wondering how you classify that. And then the bone health researcher in me can't help but think about all the wonderful research that could be done in softball pitchers, because the classic studies showing the effect of exercise and physical activity for bone health across the lifespan are really done within subject controls of baseball pitchers and catchers, demonstrating strength differences between the pitching arm and the non-pitching arm,
Mm-hmm.
and how that persists across the lifespan. So I'm assuming this is an interview at Saskatchewan, and could link you up with some pretty awesome collaborators in the bone health world, were you to want to also get into that. But that was just the first thing I thought about. Like there's so much you can do looking at other outcomes of these athletes.
Yeah, even the topic of asymmetry, I know they do a lot of that as well. So that's a good thought, Lee. Thank you. Yeah.
You seem to have a lot of data after a year or so. How do you plan to analyze those data? What kind of methods?
Sorry.
You will have millions of data.
Yeah, I will have millions of data. The plan is to use a variety of approaches. You're talking specific statistical analyses. So using things like SPM or group comparisons, but I would love to engage like a biostatistician like we do in CIPRC, where they can do some of their multilinear modeling to incorporate some of these factors. But that's a good point. Like you're trying to, you don't want the model to get too hairy when you're including too much, but to sort of tease out what's most important or interpretable for the athletes.
And if I could say I give you an additional researcher free to help you with the data analysis, what would you choose?
What analysis will he run?
What kind of type of person would you choose? What kind of type of analysis would you choose?
I think I'd get a generic statistician to help with that, but there's a lot of help that I would want. So I don't know. Do we have to pick just one?
At least one.
Yeah. Yeah, statistical approaches from, there was a guy at Auburn actually that was really intrigued, and that a lot of these points that we look at during the pitch, if you're not using SPM, you'll look at the mechanics at foot contact and then ball release and then follow through. And so they're all bounded by time. So that gets into using some structural equation modeling maybe, but that's beyond my scope of expertise. So maybe some methods like that as well as you're breaking down the pitch. But that is kind of why I choose to use SPM more regularly, to look at the full waveform anyways.
For the research part, your future plans, as Michael said, maybe you do some separate slides for the research part. So it's because I want to look at your future, right? What you are proposing as research. You propose 3 things at one slide. Maybe you open them up in each slide. And maybe a thing to do is, as Benno said, how are you going to analyze your data? You have this mount card, which is a very cool thing because it's very mobile and easy to use. You can propose an experiment fairly easy, such as you have the mount card and then you have the whole motion capture system in the laboratory. Let's say you have full data from force place, all motion, and your mount card. You can compare these two with an initial research proposal to get the useful data that the mount card shows and compare it with the full data set. So you have more ideas about how to analyze the data, and that will be an easy experiment, fairly easy experiment to use and learn all motion capture system and data set. Plus, comparison will be kind of a good paper, I guess. It might be a research team or initial experiment. And the other thing is, for the 3 research ideas, maybe you do some illustrations in each slide. Let's say you are using the mount card and then 2 kids are hitting each other, and then you expect a huge acceleration, you illustrate it, and then you propose a new experiment, very visual, so people understand it better, like, or see it better, to make it more visual. So maybe these illustrations can be in Adobe Illustrator, these programs which are fairly easy to use, so you can do it without spending a lot of time.
Yeah, that's cool. Thanks, Oz.
Any questions or comments? We have undergrads in seminar course or grad students.
A couple of questions from over the outside.
Yeah. What's so you have this mouth guard, you can measure all this stuff, and then you said you have the blood oxygenation stuff and the data in the brain as well. And what's the connection between the 2 of those? Is it not known, or?
Yeah, it's an area I'm not super familiar with, but the understanding is that we may be able to see trends or changes in brain oxygen over the course of the day relative to the impacts that we're seeing on the mat. So maybe a link there, or with the clinical symptoms, but I'll know more in like a month or 2. Yeah.
I want to go back to the body fat thing. So you talked about stature and how the best pitchers tend to be of bigger stature. And when I think of stature, I don't necessarily think of body fat. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
What?
You would have to
Oh my God. Yeah. And so did you ever look at that, like some element of stature? So if they are, if bigger stature athletes are better throwers, and then you show that body fat isn't predictive, or people with more body fat aren't better throwers. Maybe doesn't that mean that maybe body fat isn't a good marker of stature for this population?
Yeah.
And that you should be looking at something different.
Yeah. I think stature sometimes gets thrown in there as a kind way to say size in this sense, But to your point, yes, so fat-free mass. So it's not just that mass is bad, fat-free mass does link up with pitch velocity. So we know that increased mass, you could be tall and strong, could help with your pitch velocity. And specifically, it's the fat mass that's linked with the shoulder distraction forces. But there is a lot more breakdown that we could do. There's also a group at Cal Poly that's looking at the DEXA scan specifically to look at inertial parameters specific to a female to maybe get us better understanding too. Does that answer your question?
Well, sort of. It's not as simple as women that are of larger stature have greater fat-free mass as well. So they throw faster. Therefore, there's a larger distraction force on the elbow so that they are more likely to be injured. It has nothing to do with sort of fat mass per se.
Right. Yeah. Well, this study was specifically body fat mass linking up with decreased pitch velocity. But there are a number of probably confounding factors involved.
Well, just one of them, like for example, did you look at the fat or the fat-free mass? Did the women with higher fat mass also have more fat-free mass?
I don't know about that, but there was a study that involved fat-free mass and fat mass. This SPM was just a group comparison, though. I should look at that.
But was there much variability in height, or does the sport sort of select for similar height?
At that age group, there'd be a normal variation in height, I'd say, between a 14 and 18-year-old. Yeah. So you can have really short, successful softball pitchers and tall, but in the elite groups of the game, they're typically kind of giants.
I would think that this would be, especially highly competitive softball pitchers, would be one of those situations where like BMI would not be a good indication of obesity or
No.
fat-free mass, right? Like this would be one of those situations where stature, for me, it like, I don't even think of height when I think of stature. I think of almost their aspect ratio. I don't know how you quantify that, but it would, for me, it would be BMI. And so I would think that people with higher BMI, if you're a softball pitcher, it doesn't necessarily mean you have more fat mass, but you have higher BMI, and therefore you can throw faster. And, therefore, you're more likely to be injured. And if that's the case, then it doesn't discount your hypothesis of this,
Yeah.
there being this teeter-totter effect between performance and injury.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting.
Just to add off that, like I think when you watch the pitch, it's such an athletic movement. And it reminds me of sports like shot put or discus, where you know your ability to launch, create power to mass ratio, and get that acceleration, which is so crucial. You start to think, building off that, there's some other like determinant other than just that component. I'm sure even in your DEXA study, I was thinking about what he was saying, but I'm sure you could get like bone densities, you can see other components of that that probably would help to shape more of an understanding of what is it about really good softball pitchers. What are they able to do? And my brain immediately goes, is it about the shoulder? Is it actually your lower body?
Mm-hmm.
Because in so many other sports, it's how you set up your lower body. You can imagine that is there other regions that are better determinants of that.
Interesting. Yeah.
Quick question, like that percent body fat, that was all I take next to max.
Mm-hmm.
Those usually allow you to separate the body segments.
Yeah.
Did you ever look at comparing arm masses?
We are segmenting it now, but I didn't for this project, no. I'm honored you all find the softball stuff less interesting personally.
So let's switch then. Although I would like to come back to Matt's comment. I don't know softball, I don't know baseball, but in track and field, in all throwing events, the first thing you learn is you don't throw with your arms, you throw with your legs. shot put, javelin throw, discus. It's all about the leg, all about the legs. The arm is just passively coming along somehow. I'm not sure if that's true in softball as well. But I want to switch a bit because you said this is a talk for an interview. I want to talk a little bit about that because I think how you started out, to me at least, was a bit too informal and might be good, among friends, but I don't think I would describe myself as a washed up athlete and a wannabe professor. I think I would talk about myself as an ex-competitive athlete who enjoys athletics and outdoors to this day.
Okay.
And I wouldn't say I'm a wannabe professor. I think I would say it's my dream to be in academia. It's my dream to be an academic professor and to do research in the area of blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, that's good
think,
feedback.
I'm not sure, everybody on a search committee is different. But, and some people, and, and every culture is a bit different as well. The way you get in Canada or in the United States might be different than in Europe. And I just found it a bit too casual for my taste. So if I was in the committee, that's a bit negative talk about myself. Why is she portraying herself like a washed up and wannabe and this? Does she not have the confidence?
Okay.
The other thing that I was thinking about is, and I was just talking with one of my postdocs earlier today. In an academic situation, I shouldn't really say this publicly, but they don't take always the best person, but I think they take the person that fits the program best. And with your injury prevention, injury understanding, mechanism, so it's such an incredible multidisciplinary approach, and you refer to that. But I think in an interview, I'd go further. I would see at the university where I'm going to, who is in psychology, who is in rehabilitation, where is sport medicine, and would make very direct suggestions that, I'm the biomechanist, but I would like to work with her in sport medicine. I would like to work with him in psychology, and have them in place. I would, in that sense, I would position myself more directly and show that I know who these faculty is and who they are and what they are all about.
Mm-hmm.
So I would do that before.
Okay.
But now more to the fun question. Did you say you had an ACL injury?
Mm-hmm.
How do you get an ACL injury in softball?
In practice, my catcher pushed me when we were running. It wasn't softball related. Yeah. It's a competitive game.
The other thing I wanted to know is how fast is a softball pitch from a good softball player?
The best in the world is 72 miles per hour. Average is about 65 at the best level. If you watch it on TV, though, they're all clocked at 75. But don't believe that. Miles per hour.
Sorry, you don't know what that is.
That's
What's that in?
110 kilometers per hour. 62 is 100 kilometers, so 72 is 16 more, so that's like 116 kilometers per hour. So the other comment that I wanted to make, just to keep this easy. Auburn, Alabama was my first track meet in the United States in 1979, University of Iowa. Harvey Green was there, who was in 1976 Olympic 100-meter runner. Anyway, just for a fun fact, I was in Auburn, Alabama, first track meet.
That's cool.
You talk about injury, and there's two things that I was curious about. The first one is you talk about it very biomechanically, and in a variety of sports, I've seen that some people get injured and some do not, but mechanically they seem to be doing exactly the same things. I always wonder how much is the biology when people get injured, and how much is actually the mechanics.
Yeah.
And you think about that, you know, you think that maybe knowing the tissue properties, maybe knowing shoulder flexibility, maybe knowing the muscular strengths, maybe knowing about the ligaments, about the bones, might that potentially be as important or more important than exactly how somebody throws?
Yeah, it's the mechanism of injury is too difficult really to do, but it raises a good point. Like when the best pitcher in the world, I never coach my pitchers to look like her, ironically enough, because you know there's just so many different ways to throw. And I don't know that that necessarily leads to the best, but it works for her, obviously. In terms of tissue properties, probably. I think another point to consider too is workload. So what is consistent is a lot of these pitchers towards the end of the season, you really rely on one or two pitchers in a softball team. You'll have like a roster of 5. In baseball, you'll have a roster of 15 or so. And you have such mandated rest days. You don't have that in softball. So I think what's really important is to understand how workload plays a role. And so at the end of a 60-game college softball season, the main pitchers pitched 200-300 innings. And there's no regulations to minimize that number or to control that number. And so I think workload, tissue property for sure, which I don't know much about. And then I do think maybe less so for injury, but for performance, the way that you throw the pitch is important.
The other thing that I was curious about is when you said, you know, the one phase that you focused on for injury was the release. And I was just sitting here and going, well, if I had my arm like this, you know, and you're releasing there, seems to be a fairly natural position, but when they go straight up here and over their head, to me, that seems very unnatural. I can't even do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if things are not happening at a completely different place than the one that you seem to have selected. Or do you ever think about that?
Yeah, do you think things do go AWire around here, especially if they have impingement issues? But it is the highest forces that we see on the throwing shoulder at ball release, I think, because it's built up that speed to that point. But that's
highest forces that you see in the shoulder. So how do you calculate that?
with the electromagnetic motion capture system and the motion
So
monitor.
is this kind of like an inverse dynamics approach where you get
Yes.
the resultant force and moment?
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe, you know, but my hunch is that at least in javelin throwing and other throws, you know, you kind of stop at the end of the throw, you know, so you don't go like a full blast through, but you kind of already stop in here. I just wonder up here when it's very tight and it's hard to do, if the ligamentous pressures that are exerted are actually much higher, and that these internal forces that might not necessarily come out in an inverse dynamics approach. I wonder if the resultant force and moment might really not give you the right answer in this particular movement.
Yeah, that's a good point, because especially here, like you see a lot of stress on the biceps tendon, or that's where a lot of the pain complaints are. So it makes sense that that's happening in the back end
That's
of
what I was
the,
also wondering. So if somebody has pain, you know, their shoulder pains, they can't throw anymore. Does it hurt them when they have the shoulder here? Does it hurt them when they have the shoulder? Where does it hurt?
I don't know. It's a good question though.
Well, to this day, I know where it hurts me from javelin throwing. And it's really, really
Back
interesting.
here?
It's right there.
Yeah.
And when I come forward, and to this day, like I never could throw a javelin throw effort in my entire life, because just one throw, even today probably, just one throw immediately gives me pain, whereas if I do it 90%, it works. And I always thought that was fascinating. Just with one full effort. But anyway, that's a completely different story. But I just wonder if focusing on that one point, if that's maybe a good way to go, and maybe not look at all.
Yeah. With the javelin throw, you start here and run for a bit, right? And then go.
Javelin in the back, yeah, straight on.
See, I wonder, like in the softball pitch, it happens we ask them, when do you feel your pain? Is it during, after, before? And we rarely get good responses, but it happens so fast. I don't know if you can really delineate between phases of the pitching motion, but that's an interesting thought.
I think that's all for the moment.
So you had a lot of interesting studies that you pulled up from your thesis and PhD work with injury prevention. And then the second part of your work has focused on introducing, children to sports and getting them into it at an early age. So I'm wondering, do any of your findings from the injury prevention part, can they be implemented or are they being implemented in any way in those early programs? Like you mentioned, one of them being, they take a lot of breaks and walking back, for example, and they're maybe getting cooled down between their coaches. So are you implementing those findings into your research?
Yeah, we did do one study that showed pitchers who were injured more often were single sport athletes. They had specialized earlier. That was kind of separate, so that I guess would be a reason for doing the multi-sport study. But the reason, like our tri-sport is 1 hour, and I'm just like a chicken with my head cut off the whole time, just trying to get people to just keep being active, because it is so short. So, and that's with the emphasis of, making sure that while we're at our sporting event, we're being active versus like stagnant and waiting for our 1 rep. So that's kind of one way it's been implemented. And maybe, sorry.
So I think it was interesting how you talked about the 2 wins. I think it would also be interesting in your future work to connect the 2.
Yeah.
Where you're doing a lot of work in lab and off the field where you're trying to understand the mechanisms or any physiological, biological reasons why people get injured, and then kind of getting them back into not only introducing people to sport, but also practicing with, I guess, tactics, strategies to prevent injuries so they can last long.
Yeah, that's a really good idea as well. Thank you.
So the accessibility question, that you want to solve. What do you think is the biggest thing why children don't do sports as much as you would like to?
I look back and I wouldn't have played as many sports as I did if they had required me to be there as often as they're requiring kids to be at practice now. So sport used to be 1 or 2 times a week, and now it's close to 5 and 6. I think that's a huge barrier for parents, getting them to their sporting event every day after work. And I also think kids don't want to be doing the exact same thing every day, even if they enjoy their sport. You can see them.
Is therefore organized sports, even if you do it more flexible, like you advertising, is that the solution?
What was it?
Organized sport. Is organized sport a solution? You do it also in an organized way, but you give more possibilities, not only 1 sport. And you only do 2 times a week rather than 5 times. Is that the solution?
I don't know. I think at this age group, it's a good option because you don't have that conflicting schedules. Like you couldn't be in 3 sports at once if they're all at that hour on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but you can in this league. At that age, I think it's maybe a solution. And I think the proof of concept and some of the feedback we've received has been positive enough to make me think it might work. In higher age groups, I don't know if that's going to be a good option.
So in Canmore, virtually every kid that I know cross-country skis. How is that?
Every kid you know cross-country skis?
Yeah, Canmore.
In Canmore, oh, I see.
How is that?
It's accessible?
I think so. I think it's the parents and it's the accessibility.
Yeah.
That is the big interest, because a long time in my life, I taught undergraduate physical education, and 6-year-old kids, they run around. If you let them run, if you don't hold them by the hand, they just run naturally. But they need to have the ability, the possibility to run. And then, of course, once they get 10 or 11 or 12, especially am I allowed to say the women, the girls, they tend to drop out of sport, they tend to drop out of activity. And I always wondered why that is. But I think a big thing is ease of accessibility at a flexible schedule that is actually not organized. So you can go there whenever you want, type of thing. In a safe environment, of course, which I guess today the sport has not been a safe environment.
Yeah.
So I wonder sometimes if organized sport is the best solution. You said that you organized, I think, 56 children or so. I'm not sure in what kind of a community that was, and if it was 56 children community, and then you have 100% success. But if it's somewhere where you have 200,000 children, then 56 children really make a difference.
Yeah. I think though that the league being an hour on Tuesdays and Thursdays leaves room for that unorganized play. And then kids too in that age group, they're wanting to act like a pro, like they want to be part of a team and have there be some structure to at times, I think. So maybe leaving room for both is a good thing.
It always fascinates me when every once in a while I go home to visit my sister in Switzerland. And then you're there in the summer. The kids play on the road. They play all the game. They play this kind of a volleyball type of thing. They play this. They play that. They run around. And I always wonder what that is. Why these kids naturally during the summer break go outside, play with each other in the neighborhood, and that seems to be less the case in other cultures.
Yeah.
I wonder what the difference is.
Yeah.
I think so.
Parents.
I think so.
Get out.
I think that maybe it's not providing possibilities for the children. It's engaging the parents and teaching the parents what you might be able to do with your kids.
Yeah, maybe.
I guess I can speak from experience from four kids, and all of them are different. One would be on the hockey pitch every day of his life if he could, and others don't. Not sure whether there is a universal solution for this.
Yeah, I thought that was a really cool study, and I know that I have a lot of young cousins around that age group, and they're getting into sports now, and it is very much like what your parents decide to put you in, and they say we're gonna try these things, but they put them in for like one season and then never like revisit it. So it's like really cool. It would be, I think, really amazing to just get kids exposed to a lot of different sports to actually see what they like without so much time commitment, because I think that is a huge barrier, not just for the kid, but for the parents and the scheduling, and then you have multiple kids, having them in different activities, and then how you schedule around that. It's like, I can see it being very exhausting for like the parents, the family, and then that's I think the big reason, right? When you get up to more competitive levels, that you see kids drop off more, because it's just getting harder to schedule around that. So I thought it was really cool study. It would be really amazing to see how it works in other communities as well.
Yeah, thanks.
Just going back to Walter's comment about the Canmore kids question. To what extent do you think socioeconomic status plays a role? Like, would you expect differences in participation, differences in the effectiveness of actually the program, say in rural Saskatchewan, a smaller community versus like somewhere where maybe a state in socioeconomic status and they have resources to pay for sports and they aren't working, so they can drive their kids to different countries.
Yeah, I definitely think this is catered towards those with less resources to participate. Like, you need resources to participate in organized sport now. So that's really part of the goal as well. Like, we set up, and when I say core community Saskatoon, that's like an inner city Saskatoon. So it was with that intent in mind. And then I also think if you were to go to rural settings, maybe where there is less structured sporting opportunities, that this would maybe be more exciting for them than someone else who can get driven across the city and their parents can pay for all their hockey equipment and such. Yeah.
I just had an idea just listening to the conversation, but when you think about injuries and like when it was has that recursive model for injury where he's got intrinsic and extrinsic risk factors. And I was thinking about from a child's perspective, like what are the intrinsic and extrinsic factors that either increase or decrease your accessibility? So you give a kind of an interesting model, right? You're interested in injury and accessibility. There seems to be these two things, because I wouldn't say that your parents, their socioeconomic status, what they think you should go in are sort of these things that are outside your realm of control of your child. And so you start to sort of think about all the various factors. And one factor I keep coming back to on the intrinsic side for accessibility, but I think would also tie into your injury side is, I know with the LTAD in Canada for a long time, they talked about skills like motor skills being a fundamental gateway in the sport. So if you can't throw, you can't kick, you're going to step away from the sport because of the fact that you can't play.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, you know, as I was sort of like mulling over the discussion, how have you, because of your interest in biomechanics and movement, and motion capture, and wearables, and is there a way, like, have you brought in that idea about being able to kind of baseline kids' motor skills and being able to categorize them as, I'm saying this in scare quotes, but good movers and not so good movers, and who drops out, the attrition over the course of this, along with injury potentially, but how do you think that plays into accessibility?
Yeah, that's a good point. Like you ideally are learning some of those basic fundamental skills to propel you into maybe different sporting opportunities. The one study that I sort of big picture study was having that pre and post testing surrounding the multi-sport league involvement. I don't think that I dug down that rabbit hole as far as you did, but that'd be interesting to look at, especially in terms of like that long-term athlete development.
Well, and why I bring it up, Kenzie, is that like when you presented, and I sort of came a couple minutes late, I didn't realize this was for an interview. And then it sort of all solidified as the questions started coming out. But you know, I think it's one of the challenges with someone like yourself who has such a diverse background. And you were an athlete, you had injury, and now you've got this really broad interest. It's like, how do you tie it together into a theme that someone watching be like, oh, I get the anchor points.
Yeah.
And you know, it just might be a way, I don't know if there is a way, but you can kind of go back to something we already know about sport, already sort of been as internal factors, external factors. You've got this also tying around accessibility, like a neat model to understand how these things play in.
Yeah, that's really cool.
And play. Like,
Yeah, thanks, Matt.
But is that a sociological and psychological problem, or is that a biomechanics problem? Yeah,
I don't know.
the accessibility and
Like how you move. Is it yeah, is it the biomechanical thing that drives that, or
or maybe last comment I would like to make. I always felt, and that was not really mentioned, that for kids, and I think, you know, for adults as well, a lot of the time sport is really a social outlet. And I think that, you know, the social component that children have when they are in a certain group, and whether or not they fit into that group or not, and that type of stuff, I saw my own children that played a big role where they wanted to participate and where they did not want to participate. Depended a lot on the social environment and the other people that were there, whether or not, you know, they got along. So I think there's a social aspect there as well that I think plays a fairly big component, whether or not, you know, kids stick with certain activity or not. Certain security and the comfortableness that they feel is the other, is the coach, is the other children, is the whole environment. I'm not sure how you optimize that.
Yeah.
But I'm sure you can do that.
Yeah, it was kind of keeping them on that same team, I felt, was building up some of the social aspects versus, you know, getting pulled across. Matt, do you?
Just on that note, I was talking to Jeremy Witherspoon, he's a speed skating coach in Norway, but he's from Canada.
Yeah.
We were chatting about this. He said that in Norway, that's exactly how they do it. Start in your county, you'll have your group of people that you play with, whatever sport. Everyone picks a sport, but you stay with them right through the whole ranks, like from whatever age till whatever age. Whereas in Canada, like my son every single year has to try out for hockey. Who knows what team you get on? You know, you're mixed up and you wanted to be with that person, but you're not. Get with a bad team and like even like teammates. It's an interesting idea about that social part.
Yeah.
Norway does it.
And in
like that.
Norway, where they have the best cross-country skiers
Yeah.
in the world, until they're about 12 or 13 years old, they have races, but they don't get any prizes for them. You're not first, second, third, and so on. Of course, you know where you are, but first of all, they have like 200 kids in every race rather than 15 here. But there's not really a ranking, there's not really a celebration afterwards and giving prizes and medals away. It's non-competitive, it's not scoring in that sense until they're like 12 or 13 years old. I always thought was really interesting. Because at the end of the day, when they're 25, they beat everybody else in the world.
Totally.
Just something to add to that, like I'm from the Yukon and I do ski, but we are like, it's a really small community. So when you basically go into school, you're put with all these kids and all of my friends skied. And I ended up skiing all the way through to high school with that same group of friends. Nobody dropped out and we all did the same sport. And that was seen in every sport. Like all the hockey players, same thing, started like as soon as they could skate and they stayed in that same group all the way growing up. So I wonder how much, like we all played other sports and like did volleyball in high school and stuff, but I think like starting in that one group definitely had an impact for like a smaller town, especially like Calgary, there's so many leagues and everything like that, but Whitehorse, there was one ski team for everybody. So.
Interesting.
Let's thank Kenzie again.
Thanks for the feedback.